Warning: listener discretion is advised. This podcast contains detailed accounts of real crimes, including violence and psychological trauma, which may be distressing to some listeners. It is intended for mature audiences only. If you or someone you know is struggling, feeling unsafe, or in danger, please reach out for help. Support is available no matter where you are. If you're in immediate danger, please contact your local emergency services. Other useful numbers and helplines are available in the descriptions below. Imagine a quiet, humid apartment in the heart of a Midwestern city. The open window carries the faint hum of summer street life, an innocent lullaby that hides something unspeakable behind its rhythm. It is here, behind the locked door of apartment 213 in the Oxford Apartments, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that a darkness unmatched in modern criminal history was not only housed, but carefully cultivated. A darkness so deep it shattered the very idea that home, neighbor, or police could ever guarantee safety again. I'm DM Green, and this is In the Dark Mind, the podcast where we journey into the deepest recesses of human depravity, examining the men and women whose names have become synonymous with horror. Today we enter the life and the mind of Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. He would become known worldwide as the Milwaukee Cannibal. The era was the late 1970s, bleeding into the 1980s and early 1990s, a time when forensic science was still finding its footing, when rising crime overwhelmed law enforcement, and when predators like Dahmer could vanish between the cracks of indifference. Dahmer's story stands as a grotesque monument to systemic failure, proof of what happens when society looks away. He was not merely a killer, he was a psychopath who trespassed into the most forbidden corners of human behavior: sexual violence, dismemberment, and finally, cannibalism. But the true weight of the Dahmer case lies not only in the horror of his acts, but in the collapse of every safeguard meant to prevent them. For 13 years, he murdered 17 men, many young, many men of color, whose disappearances were dismissed or ignored. It forced America to confront an ugly mirror of prejudice, negligence, and moral blindness. This is not just a tale of a serial killer. It is an inquiry into the shadows of a society too slow to recognize the monster next door. How could one man turn a small, nondescript apartment into a chamber of horrors, and do so for so long without being seen? The story we are about to unfold is a descent into a mind governed by compulsion, isolation, and the complete erosion of empathy. We explore it not for sensation, but for what it teaches, about vigilance, about compassion, and about the terrifying potential of what a dark mind can create when left unchecked. This case carved a deep, jagged scar across the American psyche, the moment when the word serial killer ceased to belong to Pulp Fiction and became our living reality. Our journey begins not in blood, but in the fractured childhood of a boy who would become a monster. To understand the making of a dark mind, we must look back to its beginnings, the soil in which the first seeds of corruption were planted. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born at 4:34 p.m. on May 21, 1960, at the Evangelical Deaconess Hospital in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the first son of Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. From the very start, the home was a battlefield. Joyce struggled deeply with mental illness, frequent hospitalizations, anxiety, and severe depression. She was described as a hypochondriac, obsessed with her health, demanding constant attention, and emotionally volatile. At one point, she attempted suicide with an anti-anxiety drug called Equinil. Later, she would spend time in a neuropsychiatric facility, leaving the young Jeffrey surrounded by tension, fear, and instability. Joyce's illness created a household of emotional neglect. Arguments echoed through the walls, and moments of affection were rare, fleeting, and unreliable. Imagine a small child watching his mother's unpredictable mood swings, listening to the constant shouting between parents, and learning far too early that love could turn to chaos without warning. The foundation of safety, so critical in early development, was fractured before it ever formed. His father, Lionel, a chemist, tried to maintain order but was often consumed by his work. Scientific study kept him away for long stretches, unintentionally creating the absence of a father figure during the boy's formative years. Lionel later described Jeffrey as a good kid, but noticed a dramatic change after a painful double hernia surgery when Jeffrey was just 4 years old. Following the operation, his son withdrew inward, quiet, detached, and almost unreachable. Then, something strange began to emerge. What started as a childhood curiosity towards small animals became a chilling obsession with death itself. He began collecting roadkill, dead animals he'd find near their home. But this wasn't idle fascination. He dissected them with near-scientific precision, cleaning the bones carefully, preserving them. He displayed the remains in the woods behind their house in Bath, Ohio, where the family moved in 1968. This was not normal childhood behavior. This was the early rehearsal of control, the ability to dominate a lifeless object completely. A way to impose order on death, perhaps because his living world was so chaotic. While many serial killers display cruelty towards living creatures, Jeffrey's fixation was different, detached, methodical, and clinical. He wasn't torturing, he was studying. It was as if he was trying to understand why things die, and how they might be kept. At school, this isolation deepened. At Revere High, Dahmer was an outcast, awkward, withdrawn, and already relying heavily on alcohol by the age of 14. He drank before class, during class, after class. For him, alcohol was both an armor and an anesthetic, shielding him from the pain of alienation and numbing the violent fantasies that were beginning to take root in his mind. He began to play pranks, bizarre, unsettling ones. He would fake epileptic seizures, or mimic people with disabilities like cerebral palsy, or interrupt teachers with absurd antics. Among his classmates, this became known as doing a Dahmer. On the surface, it looked like foolish teenage behavior, but underneath, it was a defense mechanism, a mask of absurdity to hide the growing darkness inside, a way to say, "Look at me, but don't see me." In his later recollections, even Lionel Dahmer would admit he missed the warning signs. He saw a lonely, eccentric boy, not the emerging compulsion forming beneath the surface. By the end of high school, Jeffrey's life was defined by secrecy, alcohol, and fantasy. His social isolation became total, his curiosity about anatomy deepened, and the emotional chaos of childhood had crystallized into something colder, a fascination with possession, control, and death. The stage was set. The line between imagination and action was about to break. The descent from disturbed youth to active predator often begins with a moment, a final breaking point where restraint gives way to a compulsion. For Jeffrey Dahmer, that moment came in the summer of 1978, just weeks after he graduated from Revere High School. His home life had imploded. His parents' marriage, already brittle, collapsed when Lionel discovered his wife's affair in late 1977. Joyce left soon after, taking Jeffrey's younger brother David and leaving the 18-year-old alone in the quiet house in Bath, Ohio. No supervision, no structure, just silence, alcohol, and an imagination rotting in isolation. It was in that emptiness that Dahmer's dark compulsion finally took form. In June 1978, he was driving his yellow Volkswagen Beetle when he spotted a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, a 19-year-old, on his way to a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park. Dahmer offered him a ride. They went back to the empty family home, shared some beers, and, for a brief moment, it seemed almost normal. Two young men talking and drinking. But when Hicks mentioned it was time to leave, something inside Dahmer snapped. That fear of abandonment, the same one he'd known since childhood, merged with his sexual obsession and his desperate need for control. He struck Hicks from behind with a 10-pound dumbbell and then strangled him to death. It was not premeditated. It was the moment the floodgate opened. He later described it as acting on impulse, an overwhelming panic that someone he wanted to keep was about to walk away. After the murder, the calm precision returned. He dismembered the body, buried the remains, and methodically dissolved what was left with acid. The same detached focus he once applied to animal bones, now used on human flesh. The final moral barrier had been broken. The experiment had begun. After Hicks, Dahmer attempted to return to ordinary life, a life that was already disintegrating. He enrolled briefly at Ohio State University, but was expelled after 1 quarter for failing grades and chronic drunkenness. In January 1979, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, training as a medical specialist at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, then stationed in Bamholder, West Germany, with the 68th Armored Regiment. Ironically, his role gave him access to medical tools, anatomy training, and a clinical environment that would later mirror his private rituals. But behind the uniform, the same demons persisted. Alcohol abuse spiraled out of control, and reports of violence began to surface. 2 soldiers, Billy Capshaw and Preston Davis, later came forward accusing Dahmer of violent sexual assaults while stationed in Germany. Capshaw claimed he was repeatedly raped over a 17-month period. Davis described an attack in an armored vehicle, drugging, loss of time, and waking up disorientated, assaulted during a field exercise in October 1979. These claims would not lead to formal charges. Dahmer's record instead showed escalating disciplinary issues, and by March 1981, he was honorably discharged. A bureaucratic end to a quietly catastrophic chapter. He lasted just 2 years. After his discharge, he drifted south, ending up in Miami, Florida, working briefly at a sandwich shop called Sunshine Subs. He lived in cheap motels near the beach, drinking heavily and aimless. During this time, another case captured national attention: the abduction and murder of Adam Walsh, a 6-year-old boy taken from a Sears store in Hollywood, Florida, on July the 27th, 1981. 2 witnesses claimed to have seen Dahmer near the scene, but detectives later dismissed any connection. Still, the coincidence would haunt investigators for years. When the money ran out, Dahmer returned to Milwaukee to live with his father and stepmother. He found menial jobs, a phlebotomist, a sandwich maker, but continued to unravel. He was arrested several times for disorderly conduct, public intoxication, and indecent exposure. The most notable came in August 1982, when drunk at the Wisconsin State Fair Park, he unzipped his pants and exposed himself to a crowd, including women and children, near the beer tent. He was fined $50, sentenced to 1 year's probation, and ordered to attend alcohol counseling. These incidents were clear warnings, but they were treated as isolated misdemeanors. Law enforcement, blinded by outdated systems and cultural bias, failed to connect the dots. The early 1980s police had little experience with serial offenders. Databases were fragmented, and departments rarely communicated. In the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, his victims were predominantly young, gay, and men of color, a population routinely ignored or dismissed. This lethal mix of prejudice, and bureaucratic blindness became Dahmer's invisible shield. He was learning, refining, testing boundaries, and for nearly a decade after Stephen Hicks, he would go unseen, unheard, a predator hiding in plain sight. From 1978 to 1987, the darkness within Jeffrey Dahmer lay dormant, not extinguished, only waiting. Those 9 years were not a recovery, but an incubation, a time when fantasy deepened and the hunger grew more exacting and more detailed. He wanted control, absolute, unbroken, unchallenged control, the kind that could stop abandonment forever. By 1987, Dahmer was living intermittently with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, working at the Ambrosia chocolate factory. Outwardly, he appeared functional. Inside, the fantasy had metastasized into ritual. He would spend hours drinking, wandering the streets, and eventually, one evening inside a department store, he stole a male mannequin. He brought it home, he would dress it, undress it, posed with it, and slept beside it. When his grandmother discovered it and threw it away, he felt a crushing, almost physical sense of loss. He later said that moment felt like being abandoned all over again. In 1986, he was again arrested, this time for exposing himself and masturbating near 2 boys at the Kinnickinnic River. He was ordered into therapy, but no one told his counselors about the mannequin or his necrophilic fantasies. Had they known, they might have seen how close he already was to killing again. That same year, Dahmer began frequenting bars in Milwaukee's gay district, looking for company, for compliance, for victims. Dahmer checked into room 507 at the Ambassador Hotel, a once grand Art Deco landmark, now in decline. There, he met Stephen Toomey, aged 24. They drank together. Hours later, Dahmer awoke next to Toomey's body, bruised, beaten, and lifeless. He claimed to have no memory of killing him, saying, "I just wanted to lay with him. I didn't mean to kill him." Panic turned to method. He bought a large suitcase, transported the body to his grandmother's basement, and 1 week later, dismembered it, keeping the head for another week before boiling it and crushing the skull. That second killing shattered any illusion of control. It was no longer about impulse, it was compulsion. He admitted later, "After that, I didn't even try to stop." Between 1988 and 1990, Dahmer's violence escalated at a horrifying pace. His victims were mostly young men from Milwaukee's marginalized communities, gay, often men of color, and many from difficult economic backgrounds, people the system already ignored. He would lure them with offers of money or photography, drug them with halcyon, and, when they were unconscious, strangle them. Afterward, he performed sexual acts with the bodies, photographed them, and dismembered them. He preserved parts, heads, hearts, genitals, first as trophies, then as experiments in creating companions who could never leave him. In January 1988, he murdered Jamie Dockstater, age 14. In March, Richard Guerrero, age 25. Later that year, he drugged and sexually assaulted Somsak Sinthasomphon, a 13-year-old boy. Somsak survived. His family pressed charges. Dahmer was convicted of second-degree sexual assault and enticement of a minor. He was sentenced to 1 year in the House of Correction, but released after just 10 months. He was still on probation when he killed again. The next victim was Anthony Sears, aged 26, in February 1989. It was the first time Dahmer kept body parts as mementos, the head and genitals preserved in acetone. When his grandmother complained of foul smells and constant late-night activity, she finally asked him to move out. He did. And that move would open the final, most horrific chapter: the Oxford Apartments at 924 North 25th Street, apartment 213. Between 1990 and 1991, Dahmer turned that small, one-bedroom apartment into a private charnel house. He killed Ricky Beeks in May of 1990, Edward Smith in June of 1990, Ernest Miller in September of 1990, David Thomas in September of 1990, and Curtis Straughter in February of 1991. Then came Errol Lindsay in April of 1991 and Tony Hughes in May of 1991, and more to follow. By this point, Dahmer had begun conducting gruesome experiments. He drilled holes into the victims' skulls while they were still alive, injecting acid or boiling water into the brain. It was an attempt to create a living zombie, a silent, obedient partner. None survived. And then came the night of May the 27th, 1991, a night that would expose the single most devastating act of police negligence in modern criminal history. 14-year-old Konorak Sinthasomphon, the younger brother of Dahmer's earlier assault victim, escaped the apartment, naked, disoriented, drugged, and bleeding. Neighbors Glenda Cleveland, her daughter Sandra Smith, and her niece Nicole Childress found him and immediately called the police. When officers Thomas Bolsazak and Joseph Gabrish arrived, Dahmer calmly explained that the boy was his 19-year-old lover, drunk, emotional, and simply had too much to drink. Despite Glenda's protests and the visible trauma of the child, the officers escorted Konorak back into the apartment. Had they checked Dahmer's record, they would have seen his probation for the sexual assault of Konorak's brother. Had they searched the apartment, they would have found photographs, bones, and remains of previous victims. Instead, they left. Glenda Cleveland called again that night, pleading with 911, asking if anyone had confirmed the boy's identity. She was told simply, "Everything's been handled." Konorak was murdered within the hour. That failure sealed the fate of 4 more men: Matt Turner in June of 1991, Jeremiah Weinberger in July of 1991, Oliver Lacey and Joseph Braidhoft, both killed in late July. In those final months, Dahmer was unstoppable. He had tested the limits of law enforcement and found none. Apartment 213 became a slaughterhouse disguised as a bachelor's den. The smell of decomposition mixed with industrial cleaners. Neighbors complained, but were told it was just spoiled meat. The illusion held until one man finally broke it. It would not end with a detective's discovery, but with the desperate courage of a man who refused to die. It ended not through police intuition or advanced forensic work, but through one man's will to survive. The date, July the 22nd, 1991. The place, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. 32-year-old Tracy Edwards met Jeffrey Dahmer at a bar that evening. Dahmer offered him a drink, some money, and photographs. He agreed to go back to the apartment, apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments. What awaited him inside was a nightmare of stillness. The smell was heavy, chemicals and decay. A blue 57-gallon drum stood in the corner. Strange tools lined the floor, and for the bedroom, a camera, a mattress, and photographs. Dahmer placed a handcuff around Edward's wrist. He brandished a knife, and in a voice eerily calm, told him he wanted to take pictures. Edwards tried to stay composed. He talked to Dahmer, feigned interest, and waited for a chance to escape. Finally, when Dahmer was distracted, he struck, breaking free and running for the door. He bolted into the night, barefoot, shirtless, one handcuff still hanging from his wrist. 2 police officers, Robert Ruth and Rolf Mueller, were patrolling nearby when Edwards flagged them down. He was terrified, shaking, incoherent, but his story was consistent. He said a man had tried to kill him. Seeing the handcuffs still attached, the officers followed standard protocol and accompanied him back to the apartment. When Dahmer opened the door, he was calm, polite, soft-spoken. He told them it was a misunderstanding. But when Officer Mueller walked into the bedroom to retrieve the key for the handcuffs, he opened a dresser drawer and froze. Inside were Polaroids, dozens of them, bodies in various stages of dismemberment, posed, documented, catalogued. Mueller stepped back, looked at Dahmer, and said, "These are real." In that instant, Dahmer lunged for the photos, and the officers wrestled him to the floor. It was over. After 13 years of unchecked horror, the Milwaukee cannibal had finally been caught. The scene that followed was almost beyond comprehension. Police backup arrived. Detectives entered apartment 213, and what they found inside would shake the world. A head in the refrigerator, 2 more in the freezer, human hearts stored for consumption, 7 skulls neatly arranged in the bedroom, jars of preserved organs, photographs, hundreds of them, detailing each stage of mutilation, a complete human skeleton, bleached and mounted, and the blue barrel filled with acid and dissolving remains. The apartment wasn't a home, it was a labyrinth of death. News of the discovery broke within hours. Milwaukee descended into a collective horror and disbelief. The media swarmed. Crowds gathered outside the Oxford apartments. Reporters described the air thick with the stench of chemicals and decay. Neighbors stood in silence, realizing that the man they'd passed in the hallways, the quiet one who kept to himself, had been living among corpses. Forensics teams spent weeks cataloging every piece of evidence. The crime scene spanned rooms, drawers, freezers, and drums. The details were methodical, deliberate, and unimaginably cruel. But as shocking as the evidence was, the public outrage that followed was even greater. Not just towards Dahmer, but toward the Milwaukee Police Department. When the story of Konrad Sintersompfen resurfaced, that the same officers had returned a 14-year-old boy to his killer just weeks before, the outrage was seismic. Community leaders demanded answers. Activists marched through Milwaukee city center, chanting the names of the victims. They accused the police of indifference, negligence, and racial bias. The department faced one of the most intense public reckonings in American law enforcement history. An internal review found gross negligence by officers Thomas Bolsasak and Joseph Gabrish. Both were fired by Police Chief Philip Areola. The Fire and Police Commission upheld the decision, citing a complete failure of duty. Failure to investigate, failure to check records, failure to protect. But the story did not end there. In 1994, a judge named Robert J. Parins overturned their dismissals, reinstating both officers and awarding each $55,000 in back pay. Chief Areola appealed the ruling to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. He lost. Officer Bolsasak would go on to serve as president of the Milwaukee Police Association from 2005 to 2009, before retiring in 2017. The irony was staggering. Meanwhile, one woman, the neighbor who refused to look away, was finally acknowledged. Glenda Cleveland, whose repeated 911 calls went ignored, was honored by the Milwaukee Common Council in 1991 for her civic courage. She died in 2011 at the age of 56, hailed as a symbol of what it means to speak when no one else will listen. With Dahmer in custody, the investigation widened. Dozens of missing person reports were cross-checked. DNA analysis began linking his confessions to real names, real families, and real grief. 17 known victims, years of horror, and one man whose meticulous record-keeping left a trail of photographic proof so detailed that investigators could reconstruct nearly every murder. There was no doubt the dark mind of Jeffrey Dahmer had finally been exposed, and the world would never look at evil the same way again. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer began on January the 30th, 1992. The courtroom was filled with a strange silence, part horror, part fascination. By now, the world knew what he had done. The question was not if he is guilty, but why. 17 victims, confessions given freely, photographs and remains that left no room for doubt. The prosecution and defense agreed on the facts. What they fought over was Dahmer's sanity. Was he legally responsible for his actions, or was he driven by a compulsion so consuming that he could no longer control it? The defense, led by attorney Gary Boyle, argued that Dahmer was insane, that he suffered from multiple psychological disorders, necrophilia, schizotypal personality disorder, and an uncontrollable paraphilic compulsion to dominate and preserve his victims. Boyer described him as a man enslaved by his own diseased mind, a person acting under an irresistible impulse rather than deliberate choice. Dr. Fred Berlin, a psychiatrist for the defense, testified that Dahmer's actions were driven by a compulsive, pathological desire to keep his victims with him forever, to create permanent companionship out of death itself. He argued that this obsession destroyed Dahmer's ability to conform to the law, that his mind had been consumed by a paraphilia so powerful it erased free will. But the prosecution, led by District Attorney E. Michael McCann, rejected that argument outright. They didn't deny that Dahmer was mentally ill, but they insisted he was sane. McCann laid out a chilling truth. Dahmer planned, he hunted, he hid evidence, he cleaned, he lied to the police, and he lured his victims carefully. That, McCann said, was not the behavior of a man overcome by madness. It was the cold calculation of a predator who knew exactly what he was doing. Prosecution psychiatrist Dr. George Palermo agreed. He described Dahmer as a sexual sadist who derived gratification from power and control, fully aware of his acts and their consequences. Palermo said he was not compelled by madness, he was compelled by desire. Throughout the trial, Dahmer sat motionless, expressionless, listening, sometimes taking notes, rarely reacting. To many observers, his detachment was more disturbing than any outburst could have been. When given the chance to speak, his words were brief, measured, almost mechanical. I know what I did was wrong. I knew it when I was doing it. I deserve whatever I get. The most unforgettable moments, however, came not from him, but from the families of his victims. Their grief filled the courtroom with raw humanity that no legal argument could dilute. Rita Isbell, sister of victim Errol Lindsay, stood before Dahmer and screamed, "I hate you, Jeffrey Dahmer. I don't ever want to see your face again." Then she lunged towards him, her anguish breaking through every barrier of courtroom decorum. That moment tore through the sterile air of legal procedure, reminding everyone that this was not just psychology or pathology, it was the wreckage of real lives. On February 15, 1992, after less than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury rejected the insanity plea. Jeffrey Dahmer was found guilty but sane on all 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, a total of 941 years in prison. In his final remarks, Judge Lawrence Graham Jr. told Dahmer, "You are the worst nightmare imaginable. I do not fault you for being sick. I fault you for choosing evil." In prison, Dahmer was largely isolated. He reportedly became religious, spending his final months reading the Bible, attending chapel, and corresponding with his father. But redemption, if it existed for him, would not come in time. On the morning of November 28, 1994, at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver, a man who claimed he was following God's will. He struck Dahmer repeatedly with a steel bar from the prison weight room. By the time the guards arrived, the Milwaukee cannibal was dead. Some called it divine justice, others simply a quiet end to a monster's life. But the questions his crimes left behind, about mental illness, about systemic failure, about human evil itself, would not die with him. Jeffrey Dahmer's story did not end with his death. In many ways, it was only then the true reckoning began. Because what he left behind wasn't merely the horror of 17 murders, it was a mirror, forcing America to confront the cracks within its systems, its prejudices, and its understanding of evil itself. The case became a watershed moment in criminal profiling and forensic science. Until Dahmer, most serial killer profiles fit one of two molds: the organized predator or the disorganized impulse killer. But Dahmer was both. His crimes were methodical, yet chaotic. He planned each encounter, yet acted on compulsions he described as uncontrollable. He collected trophies, but not as mere souvenirs, as attempts to preserve people he could never truly possess. This complexity forced behavioral profilers to expand their understanding of pathology, to account for sexual compulsion, ritual behavior, and necrophilia as primary motivators rather than side effects of rage. He was the embodiment of the paraphilic killer, one who murders not for power or revenge, but to fulfill an eroticized obsession with control and permanence. Forensic science, too, was forever changed. The sheer scale of evidence found in apartment 213, bones, acid drums, Polaroids, preserved organs, was unprecedented. It pushed investigators to develop new cataloging systems for complex, multi-site crime scenes, and it underscored the need for better interdepartmental communication. The investigations into Dahmer's crimes contributed to federal support for the creation of CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, which became fully operational nationwide in 1998. But the most powerful legacy of Dahmer's case was not technological, it was social. Because when the facts emerged, when the story of Konrad Sintersompfen and the ignored 911 calls became public, the outrage was no longer just about murder, it was about indifference. The idea that the police had literally returned a child to his killer because they were uncomfortable confronting a gay man of color was a revelation of systemic failure. It wasn't just a policing error, it was a moral one. The Milwaukee Police Department faced intense public scrutiny. Protests swept throughout the city. Activists demanded reform, not only for racial bias, but for the way law enforcement treated missing persons from the LGBTQ community and minor communities. As a result, departments nationwide began adopting new policies, mandatory reporting protocols for suspected abuse or endangerment, duty to intervene clauses requiring officers to act whenever they suspected a crime, regardless of discomfort or prejudice. Cultural sensitivity training became standard, particularly around handling same-sex domestic disputes and missing LGBTQ victims, a demographic once dismissed as runaways. The Dahmer case became a rallying cry, a painful but necessary catalyst for what would evolve into community-orientated policing in the 1990s. It was a reminder that the people most often ignored were the ones who needed protection the most. Beyond policing, Dahmer's case became a grim symbol in American psychology, a modern parable about the nature versus nurture debate. Was Jeffrey Dahmer born evil or made that way? Was it his schizotypal and paraphilic disorders, the genetic blueprint of a disordered mind, or the chaos and neglect of his early home life that created the monster? Experts remain divided, but the consensus leans towards a haunting truth. It was both. A perfect storm of biology and circumstance, a dark mind born predisposed and then molded by trauma, isolation, and addiction. In the decades since his death, Jeffrey Dahmer has remained a subject of books, documentaries, and dramatizations, a name etched permanently into the cultural vocabulary of evil. But in all the retellings, it's easy to lose sight of the victims, the young men whose lives were reduced to footnotes in his pathology. They were not statistics, they were sons, brothers, friends, each with dreams, laughter, and futures stolen. Their stories reshaped how America viewed not only its killers, but its own conscience. Dahmer's story continues to evoke fascination, perhaps because it defies the human desire to categorize evil, to keep it distant, inhuman, something that could never live next door. But the true terror of Jeffrey Dahmer is not that he was different from us, it's that he looked like us, spoke like us, lived quietly, smiled politely, paid rent, went to work, and hid a nightmare behind a locked door. He remains the most chilling reminder that the face of evil can wear the most ordinary mask. As our descent into the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer reaches its end, we step back from the crime scenes, the photographs, and the pathology, and return to the one thing that matters most, the human cost. The Oxford apartments are now gone, demolished, erased from Milwaukee's skyline, as if removing the building could somehow remove the memory. But the emptiness that remains there is not measured in concrete or rubble. It's measured in lives, in 17 young men who will never grow old. Each of their names should be remembered, not as part of a headline, but as the very heartbeat of this story. Stephen Hicks, Stephen Toomey, Jamie Doxteter, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Ricky Beeks, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Strauter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Conrad Sinter-Somfen, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft. 17 names, 17 stories, 17 families who will never again find peace in silence. For all the fascination surrounding Dahmer, it is crucial to remember he was not a supernatural force, not a phantom or a demon. He was a man, a deeply broken one, enabled by the blindness of the systems around him. Police who didn't listen, a society that looked away, and neighbors who sensed something wrong but weren't believed. The real horror of this story is not just in what he did, but how easily he did it. The red flags, the animal dissections, the alcoholism, the indecent exposures, the missing men were all there, one after another, and still no one connected them. And so the darkness grew. It grew quietly behind thin apartment walls, beneath the hum of an ordinary refrigerator where human remains were being stored beside cans of beer. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is a brutal reminder that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it smiles, sometimes it hides behind politeness and routine. It's also a lesson about vigilance, about empathy, and about the moral obligation to see what's in front of us. When the vulnerable cry out, when the marginalized go missing, when something feels wrong, we cannot afford to look away, because indifference is the accomplice of evil. The dark mind is not born overnight. It forms slowly, fed by neglect, fueled by obsession, and enabled by science. And sometimes, the difference between a tragedy averted and a nightmare unleashed is one person who chooses to act. May we never forget that. I'm DM Green, and this has been In the Dark Mind. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think, don't forget to subscribe for more true accounts from the darker corners of the human psyche. Until the next time, sleep well. For those who wish to explore this story further, to look beyond the sensational headlines and into the documented history of the case, there are several sources worth seeking out. A Father's Story, written by Lionel Dahmer, offers a rare, deeply human perspective. It's not a justification, but a raw and painful account from a father trying to understand the unthinkable. Through his words, we see not only Jeffrey the killer, but Jeffrey the child, the quiet boy who vanished long before the crimes began. The Man Who Could Not Kill Enough by Anne E. Schwartz, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel reporter who broke the story, remains one of the most detailed and reliable chronicles of the investigation and trial. Schwartz's reporting captures both the chaos and the determination of those who worked to bring the truth to light. Another revealing work, Grilling Dahmer, by Patrick Kennedy and Robin B. Adams, offers a first-hand account from one of the detectives who interviewed Dahmer after his arrest. It delves into the interrogation process, where Dahmer, calm and cooperative, described his crimes in cold, clinical detail, not to boast, but almost to explain himself. For visual accounts, two key documentaries stand apart. The Jeffrey Dahmer Files in 2012 interweaves real interviews with dramatized sequences, featuring testimony from law enforcement and Dahmer's neighbor, Glenda Cleveland, the woman who tried to stop him when the system would not. My Friend Dahmer, 2017, based on the graphic novel by Dirk Backdorf, a high school classmate of Jeffrey's, offers a haunting portrayal of his teenage years. It doesn't excuse him, but it does force us to see the quiet, creeping formation of the person he would become. Each of these works serves a purpose, not to glorify the crimes, but to preserve the lessons they carry. Because the Dahmer case is not just a story of murder, it is a warning about silence, about apathy, about what happens when evil finds comfort in invisibility. If you found this story insightful, if it challenged your thoughts or moved your conscience, please take a moment to follow and subscribe. This has been In the Dark Mind, real stories of real darkness, told to remind us how fragile the light can be. I'm DM Green. Thank you for listening, and until the next time, sleep well.